welcome to In the Margins. Today, we're going to delve into the importance of incorporating data skills into the curriculum in the classroom. I'm Ralph Newell from Diverse, and today's podcast is sponsored by Tableau. Today's guest is going to be Dr. Melody Goodman, Associate Dean for Research and Professor of Biostatistics at NYU. Welcome, Dr. Goodman.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you. Let's not wasting time. We'll just jump right in. Just pretend like, I'm ignorant and our audience is ignorant of this. Can you just sort of explain, what exactly is data and why are data skills important?
Well, according to The Economist, data is the world's most valuable resource. Surpassing oil in 2017, although who knows now, given the situation with oil. But right. I think given that data is so important, and it's used probably in ways that most people don't even think about across a broad spectrum of disciplines and fields, I think it's important for all of our students to understand, what data is and how to use it. It's actually important for the general public to understand what data is and how to use it. And I think the COVID pandemic made that a real reality. A lot of my work stemmed from that. When I was watching on TV, people present data and me thinking, it doesn't seem like you even understand what you're sort of presenting. You're just saying it, which means that the audience is probably not receiving it. Because the person delivering it, may or may not understand it fully, right? And so data is a lot of things. And I think people often think of data as just numbers, and it is that. But, according to the National Institute of Health, data is everything. It's pictures, it's, your instruments that you collect data with, like everything we sort of use ultimately becomes data that can be stored and shared with others and used in the future. So while my focus as a biostatistician is mainly on quantitative data, I think of data extremely broadly in terms of qualitative data. I've done work with photos, which I think is really unique data. When you have pictures, that's a really unique form of data. We pull data off of social media now. So you think you're speaking to your public, but there's researchers scraping the internet, reviewing tweets and analyzing that type of data as well. So I think the word data is really broad. And I think depending on who you ask, they could give you a very different example of what data is to them. But I think it's important that we keep the definition broad. Because new types of data are being invented all the time. Think about your Fitbit or your Apple Watch that we didn't have, a decade ago, right? I'm right. Too. It is collecting data on you every instant, right? So it's not like, I do a lot of survey research. It's not like answering a survey. You're just wearing it, right? And it's collecting all of this data, your number of steps. It'll collect when you sleep. It'll collect your heart rate. Think about all the information we now have on people that every day, every moment of the day, and every day that they wear it, we have this information. So I think we have to keep our definition broad because there's always new forms and types of data that are popping up. Like I just said, people are using Twitter as data, right? And so people use Facebook posts as data. And so I think, with the advent of all of the technology comes lots of new forms of data. Why Twitter and Facebook are free is because they're collecting your data and selling that. That's the product, right? You're really the product, right? And that's why it's free. And so data is everywhere. And these companies are using it in ways that I don't think everyone really understands. For example, when you upload pictures to Instagram, Instagram owns those pictures. And I don't think most people read the fine print enough to understand that you're using these free services, but you're also giving your data away to those companies.
I've been with you on everything you said. Just got one question that, you sort of piqued my interest in sort of digressing here. So how is a photo data? Like, how do you use a photo as a data point, if you will?
So in the work there's lots of ways that photos can be data. I have a friend who does, a colleague, Dr. Noya Kawati, who does archivist research, and she pulls up photos from the past, looking at how racism played out in restaurants in the past. In my own current research, I use photo voice, where I ask participants to take pictures of things in their community and tell me a story about that and why this picture is important to them. And that's a form of data. So yeah, pictures are really a new form of data. Even the memes we make and the gifs on social media, those can be data points if they're in response to, a lot of people during the pandemic were pulling out anything that had COVID as a tweet, right? And some of those include memes and GIFs about, the announcements or the things. Those are also data points.
No, you're right. I mean, I just had to think outside the box, if you will. I hate that cliche, but when I was just thinking about a photo in general. But when you said it, made me think about, as a kid, my mother would take us to art galleries, and we'd just look at paintings. But she would always say, "Look at that image and tell me a story." You know what I mean? And I know that she used to use that as like a teaching moment, and then we would talk about other things. So, okay, I get it. So I wasn't thinking about a photo. Why would you say, I guess sort of a two-part question. I think you have really sort of answered why data is important. Now I want to know, why is it important for us in general and for our students to have data skills?
So I think data literacy is immensely important, right? So one of the things that people come to school for is to become literate, right? When we think about reading and writing. And then in health, there had been this big push for health literacy, and people really understanding their health to make informed decisions. Some of my work has been around research literacy, right? Getting general public to understand how research works. And I now have been really focused on data literacy. And it's important for a lot of reasons. A lot of the data we use isn't collected to answer the questions we are trying to answer with it. We're often doing what we call secondary data analysis, right? We're trying to use some other data source to answer a question that we want to know. But context of data collection is so important in terms of the estimates that you make, the inferences that you make from the data, the conclusions you draw, and even the policy decisions that can result from some of the analysis. And one of the things that became really clear is that whoever does the analysis is essentially the narrator. They're telling the story, right? And they're telling the story from their perspective. And in many cases, data scientists and statisticians are not black and brown folks. And so their version of the story didn't jive with how I viewed some of those same results. And one of the things that we teach students in intro biostatistics is that it's both an art and a science, right? So the science gets you the number, that's the value. But how you interpret that number, that's an art form, right? And the same number could be up for interpretation. A good example, if a glass is half full, right? We do this all the time. Some people will say the glass is half full, and someone else will come up and say the glass is half empty. Right. That's a 50-50 percentage, right?
No, alternative facts.
Right. And so we need to be able to look at data and decide if we agree with the story that the narrator is telling, if we think there's another way that this could have happened, or sometimes I just completely disagree, right? But you have to be literate enough to say like, oh, I see your point, and I wholly disagree with that point, right? You have to understand data enough to be able to disagree in that way. And I think the general public has been trained that when someone gives you a pretty graph or a pretty figure, that's great knowledge. But not every pretty graph is a great way to show the information, doesn't always convey the information that people are looking for. And I think we have to be a little bit more skeptical about the data that's presented to us. And especially in terms of COVID, the pandemic, we've sort of made public health an individual level feat these days. And so it's really important for people to understand the data so that they can make informed decisions about their own behaviors and practices.
Yeah. No, I mean, for another conversation, we'd love to get, to talk a lot about the COVID data. But just, personally, how did you even get into data? Like, what was the emphasis for you to say, I want to study data? and how it's used?
I've always been a math nerd. I majored in applied math and statistics and economics undergrad. I wanted to be rich, so I went to Wall Street after undergrad. And there's where I learned that rich has more to do with just money. I didn't want to make rich people richer for a living. I really wanted my work to have some sort of impact. And that's what drove me to public health, which I think is an amazing field to be in. And biostatistics is basically, the statistics of public health. And, my whole world is around data. I think for me in the beginning, I wanted all the data I could get my hands on. That's just like a nerdy thing. And,
right.
And I wanted to do all the analysis, but I think as I get older, it's become more important for me, for other people to be able to understand data. Like I could do all these complex statistical things, but I feel like my impact is helping people who don't understand data at all to just get a little bit of an introduction. So we've done work to introduce students to the field, but we've also done work to introduce the general public, particularly Black and Brown folks, to the field, because we feel like data is often missing from education, particularly for Black and Brown folks who haven't had access to great educational sources. Some of us have, I went to Harvard, so some of us have had that access, but many of us haven't. And if you're older, like me, like data wasn't a big deal about a decade or so ago, right? And then it just sort of blew up. So it could be that you were trained, many, many years ago, and now it's really important. The other thing I want to say is there's a real ethical issue for me here. And for me, I think diversifying our field is an ethical issue because who narrates the story? I think diverse narrators, right?
Yes, absolutely.
But also, we can't have some of our population, only those with PhDs and the like, understand data, and the general public to not understand data. Yet on the news, we are constantly throwing data points at people who are supposed to take them at face value, right? And I think what the pandemic has also showed us is that it hit different communities differently in terms of demographic factors, but also in terms of geography and timing, right? And so I was in New York City during the heart of the pandemic. We got hit early, we got hit hard. But what we were doing in New York City, maybe someone in the Midwest didn't need to do when we were doing it. They probably needed to do it a little bit later. And you need that data to understand those decisions. And as we take public health away from the public and make it a more individual feat, making smart decisions about your life and your access. For example, I plan on going to a Mary J. Blige concert tomorrow evening, which I would not have done, right? But I'm going to double mask. I'm going to try to stay away. I'm not going to go to the front of this, right? Like, so I'm going to plan to do it as safely as I possibly can. And I think people need that information to make those types of life decisions, right? No one wants to stop doing the fun things that we were once doing, but you need enough data. Like I know that in Philly, the rates of COVID are rather high right now. And so I know that I cannot be in this environment without a mask on, right? But if I'm not someone who can pull the data for Philly, right? And I'm not local to Philly, so I'm not local to the news here, it would be hard for me to make a decision about whether to make this trip to Philly and whether to participate in some of the events that I plan to participate in. And I think it's important for the general public to be able to make these informed decisions. It shouldn't just be the biostatisticians and the epidemiologists who have this information. A lot of what people need to know does not require PhD level skills. We haven't taught it to the general public. And I think that is where the work that me and some of my colleagues are doing in terms of trying to increase quantitative public health data literacy has been filling a gap for people.
Yeah. I'm glad you are, I'll just say, keeping it simple. I didn't want us to get all, I think, as you said earlier, nerded or geeked out with, talking about data analytics, especially as a STEM discipline. So as you've already alluded to, data usage goes, way beyond just computer science and technology. We do see the needs in areas such as marketing and humanities and I mean, like even just going to a concert of using data. So with, we're all just inundated with, as you said earlier, just tons of data points, right, coming at us in different ways. But as a professor, looking at your students coming in out of K-12, would you say right now that they are at a data skill deficit?
Yes. I think in our primary schools, we teach math, we don't teach data. And I think we really need to rethink how we're teaching math because data is so common in sort of everyday world. I think data literacy needs to be up there with sort of reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? We need to really think about making sure that everyone in this country and other countries, I think, do a little bit of a better job than we do, has the ability to, everyone, I don't want everyone to be an analyst. I don't want to put myself out of a job and I want to be able to make a good living. But everyone should have the ability to read data, understand what they're seeing, but also to communicate with data. A lot of what, the work that I've been doing is trying to teach community members how to use data to advocate for the resources, the things that they need in their community that they're lacking. And one of those things I think is really important, and I think Tableau is really good for this, is using data to tell a story. So you can zoom in on a single data point. You can sort of tell your whole story with a dashboard, and it allows you to build in some of the narrative, some of the talking you would do. You can sort of show this whole story visually. And I think the general public has interacted with Tableau in ways that they probably have not thought of. If you've seen the Johns Hopkins COVID dashboard, and many of us have, that is a Tableau built dashboard. So our public is interacting with these data sources. And I think it would just be better if we informed them a little bit more so they knew how to use this data. They knew how to interpret the story, or they could tell a different story if they wanted to. If you disagree with how policies are being implemented, one of the best ways to set up an argument is to have data and a narrative, right? So data to support the human story that you're trying to make the advocacy for, that you're trying to advocate for.
So, I think we both would agree that, we've all been exposed to data, I don't want to say since the beginning of time, but probably so, but definitely, more so than the past 10 years. So, data has been in the classroom, but maybe it just hasn't been brought out the way it needs to be brought out today. So how would you say we need to teach students data analysis and literacy different than what they're doing now?
I think when I learned data in a classroom, particularly in elementary school, I think I learned about money or time. And then when you get to high school, you usually learn it in like an Excel format where there's rows and columns. But today, data is actually a commodity. People buy and sell data. They use it for politics in terms of how to target messaging. We use it for health in terms of the pandemic. So yeah, I think that the types of data we have, like I talked about the Fitbit and stuff, like that didn't exist when I was in, I'm going to date myself, but that didn't exist when I was in elementary school. So there was no way that my elementary school teachers could have prepared me for that kind of but it exists now, and we should be preparing our students. I mean, everyone who has an Apple Watch is reading lots of data every day, or a Fitbit, right? Because it gives you a bunch of data points, heart rate, number of steps taken, miles, it gives you a whole bunch of stuff. And, different people use it for different things. But we need to really train our general public. If data is the world's greatest commodity, and, we probably could debate that, then everyone should understand how it works. And particularly for me, since companies now buy and sell our data, I think it's immensely important for all of us to understand what they could potentially do with that data. Because I don't think we often think about, as a researcher, I hope that everyone uses data for good and does great research, but that's not the case always. Some people use data to do not so great things, or have, nefarious intentions. And And so it's important to be able to combat that. And the only way you can combat that is to really understand the data, to make a strong argument about why it isn't appropriate for the question at hand, and to pull some other data. I'll give you a big example that I use a lot in my classroom. I think the public is inundated with negative statistics about Black men, in particular, Black people in general. And so one of the things I do in my courses is I give people lots of positive statistics about Black men and Black people in general. And I tell them, the next time you hear a negative one, you have to now repeat a positive one to someone else, because that's how we change that narrative. But if all you hear is negative statistics, you can believe that this group of people is harmful, not productive in terms of citizenship, et cetera, et cetera. But I have lots of data that show that Black men are great fathers, that they engage in their children's lives more than men of any other race when they're allowed to, right? So there's a lot of data to contradict some of the narrative that I was taught growing up, but I don't think we know that. And I think that had I not been where I sit to say, like, stop giving me negative statistics, or I'm just going to start giving you positive ones, and to not have a skill set that allowed me to do that, you could easily believe from the media that Black men are these awful creatures, right? That are not responsible. And that's absolutely not true in this country based on data.
Right. Not only is it not true, I mean, it's so prevalent, you get Black people even believing that in some cases. So I like your idea of taking a positive. I mean, when you get a negative, to give back a positive. We sort of talked about, you were saying that you do feel that students are coming in into higher ed with a deficit of data skills. So how do you help your students increase their data skills once they're in the classroom?
So I teach a couple of courses. One course I teach or developed and taught is Introduction to Data Management and Statistical Computing, right? And this is for biostatistics students. And I think it's really important because even our students who are biostatistics, master students who've worked, at this point, they've worked with data, they often, we do our students a disservice when we give them very clean data sets, right? Like we give them an assignment and we give them some data set that's like already set up to do whatever thing we want them to do. And we don't teach them that, like, it probably took someone 30 minutes to get that data set into shape for you to have this perfectly curated data set to do this problem that we're using to teach. I teach my students with dirty data because I need them to learn that if you pull data off and it's not going to be clean, you have to clean it, right? Like if you pull something straight off the internet, it could be in good shape or it may not be. You have to be literate enough to know, like, oh, this data needs to be cleaned before I can analyze it. And I think as professors, we're trying to get to the how do you do the analysis? So we skip the how do you prepare your data for the analysis? But in the real world, at least for me, I spend a lot of my time, most of my time, preparing the data. The analysis is the sort of quicker part of it. The most time is like preparing the data so that it's set up, it's clean, it's ready to do the analysis that I want to do. The other class that we started in the height of the pandemic in summer of 2020, it was during the pandemic. It was right after the death of George Floyd. People were out in the streets protesting, and I think that's a great way to do stuff. And I was saying, like, what am I going to do, right? Like, I could go walk in the streets and protest and be another number in the crowd, or maybe I can do something different. And I got with my colleague, Dr. Janice Johnson-Dias, who's a sociologist at John Jay. So you have a sociologist and a biostatistician. And we developed the Quantitative Public Health Data Literacy Training Program. And part of it was, in the summer of 2020, many students lost their internships because we hadn't figured out yet that we were going to Zoom everything. And so they just lost their in-person internships. And we wanted to give students something they could do over the summer to help boost their skills. And I thought, how do I reach people that would never have access to an NYU professor, right? Because my students have access to me. How do we reach people that would not have access to us? And can we take a class that I would have taught at NYU and give that out to students who wouldn't have this opportunity. One of my mentors, Dr. Kamara Jones, when she defines racism, she talks about the fact that racism really limits people from opportunity and opportunity structures. And I wanted to change that, right? Like I can't fix everything, but I can give some people an opportunity, right? And I can give some people access to an NYU professor and to the resources that NYU has in terms of software and things of the like that they may not have access to. And so it was really important for us to reach out to students who were at HBCUs, who were at community colleges, who were in high school, who, probably have access to some things, but didn't have access to the type of things that we have access to Tableau at NYU. And, we have access to all of these things that are really expensive. And to give students this opportunity. And in my mind, I thought if I could get 20 students, it would be great. We received almost 700 applications.
Wow.
We trained over 100 students live and another sort of probably 100 or so remotely. Predominantly Black and Latinx students. So the first cohort was 70% Black and Latinx. And there's a couple of things that I think I've learned from this. We know, particularly Black students, have been pushed out of STEM, really starting in elementary school, and it continues through secondary education. One of my goals is to get those students who have been kicked out and roll out the red carpet and welcome them back into these fields. And the way you do that is to create an environment that makes them feel comfortable in learning, comfortable enough to ask questions, to say when they don't understand things, and make it fun. So we really curate, we have a music list. So when you join the course and you come in, there's music playing. We're welcoming you to our data party. We're excited. So the students get excited. They want to learn. We show that we're Black nerds and we know this data, and we're trying to encourage other students to be the same. I think having classrooms that are diverse, but predominantly minority, change the game. It's even good for the white students.
Right.
Think about. And this environment, we've had students talk about, to have 2 Black female instructors. They felt comfortable asking questions that they'd never asked before, things that they learned but didn't really learn. Like you may learn mean median mode, right? You may know those terms, but maybe you don't really know it. Like you know the words, but you don't really know it. Or if a data set is skewed or symmetric, you may know the terms, but you don't really. And it allowed them to ask questions about, like, what does it really mean to be skewed? Why is the median important? Why is the mode important? And created this space where they were able to really beef up their skills in a way. And I think foundational skills are so important, because what I tell my students is, I'm going to give you enough, and then you can Google and YouTube university your way to the rest. But if you don't have that foundation, then Google and YouTube are not that helpful. But if I give you enough of the language, the understanding, the basics, then you can increase your own skills post whatever I give you afterwards on your own. And so that's what we've been trying to do. Just give people enough that they can use the internet to fill the other gaps. But if you don't have that basic foundation, then the internet becomes this thing of like, I don't even know if this is good or bad, or like what I'm learning is what they're saying. And I think, really being intentional about, we really explain to the students why we think it's important for them to understand data. We even created a little video about, how people use data to make decisions, and how ultimately that can mean life or death for Black and Brown folks. And so it's important for us to understand how they're using the data, for us to understand the data and the context. And I think when students really grasp, like, oh, this is important, not just for my career, which it is, most careers now require some knowledge of data, but it's important for my life and my community, they want to learn. When we leave, they always say, We wish it was longer. We wish we could learn more. And when I teach my regular classes, at the end, the students never tell me they want the class to be longer. They want more stuff. They're happy with whatever I fit into the semester, right? But the idea that these students come in and they go, oh, this is important, and I'm learning it, and I understand how to apply it to my life, to my community, to have impact. I think that is really game changing. I think the other thing it's done, at least for some students, was, we had a young lady who wrote an application, because one of the things we asked is, why do you want to take this training? And she said, I'm a culinary arts major. So this was the beginning of the pandemic, where like being a culinary arts major did not seem like it was going to be great because restaurants weren't doing well.
Right.
Culinary arts major. My advisor will not let me change to a STEM major because he doesn't think I can do it. So I want to take this course to show him that I can do it. She took it, she did well. She took her certificate back to her advisor, who let her change into a STEM major. It sucks that she had to do that she couldn't just change without it. But what our training did for her was two things. It allowed her advisor to change, but it gave her confidence, right? So the first time her advisor said, no, you can't change into STEM, she took that answer. The second time, she said, excuse me, I've taken a STEM course, I've done well, I have a certificate, I can do this, right? So the confidence of I hear your point, but I disagree, right? And I said that earlier, I hear your point, but I disagree. She only had one data point, which was this training class, right? But it gave her enough confidence to disagree with someone who was really pushing her into a discipline that she wasn't sure she wanted to be in, but was really, this push out of STEM is real, who was really telling her like, I don't think you're qualified. And here's my thing. And Dr. Jones says this a lot. It is highly unlikely that all of the genius in this country comes out of the suburbs. If you don't believe that there's genius in our ghettos, in our barrios, and our reservations, as much as there is in our suburbs, then I have a point with you that I probably disagree with. But if you agree with me that talent is likely equally distributed across race, across socioeconomic status, then as a country, we are missing out on all of the great talent that is in the ghettos, the reservations, and the barrios for the talent that's in the suburbs. And I'm not saying that great talent doesn't come out of the suburbs.
Right.
But I think that we need to be more diverse in where we choose our talent from. And so the point of this was to say that we believe that there's great talent in our ghettos, in our reservations, in our barrios.
Yeah.
And we're willing to go in there, give them some energy, and help pull that genius out of them. And it's to the benefit of everyone in society if we get all of the genius that we have on earth and really nurture that. And I was lucky. I came from a low-income community myself, and people decided early on that I was smart and nurtured that and protected that. That is not the case for most Black women growing up in a low-income situation. Right. Yeah. But it should be. It absolutely should be. Yeah. And if it's not, then those of us who really care about this need to make the effort. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out where the other geniuses are that we're not tapping into, how to motivate them, how to activate them, how to give them the support and resources they need to reach their full potential. Because if we believe that genius is equally distributed, what is not equally distributed is opportunity.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what we're trying to change, is the opportunity to show your genius and to show that you can do this work.
Right. Okay. For our folks, our faculty members, instructors that are listening, who aren't teaching a pure data science courses like you, and they're teaching the humanities and marketing and courses like that, how rigorous do you think they should get with using data in a classroom if it's not a quote unquote, pure data science type course?
I mean, you should probably never ask a biostatistician that, because I'm going to say they should get extremely rigorous with data. And I'm someone who I appreciate words as data, but I'm not really in that lane. But words are data, right? And so they should get rigorous because they're also trying to prove hypotheses or make points. The other thing is, even how you disseminate your work, And then the other point that I would make is the point I've already made is the point of ethics. So I'm a proponent that we should teach data ethics in every course, even if it's just a little bit. Because if you teach data at all, you need to teach the ethical components of that, even in a humanities course, right? Because, for example, I talked about my colleague doing archival research, right? You know, we have the Blacksonian, which is great now, but many things that may be important to Black people may not have been archived because they didn't seem important to people who were archiving things at the time. So even though I'm not a humanist, I understand that like you need to understand data in your sources. If you're going back into newspapers, you need to understand like what potentially would be printed and what wouldn't be printed, right? You need to know that you may need to find the Black newspaper in that community to get the information you need because it may not have appeared in the mainstream daily news of that, you know, city or neighborhood, right? And so even a humanist needs to understand these things about data in order to do their work. I mean, I don't know if Tableau wants me to say this, but like, you know, the United States is some systematic racism built into it, which means that's also built into our data, right? And it's not that we can't use that data, but we need to be clear about what the implications are and what the potential biases are of that data. And that's why the literacy piece is so important, because I'm not telling people not to use data that is flawed. I use flawed data all the time, but the point is to be able to make the caveat that I'm using this data that I know is flawed in this way, that may potentially bias my results in this way or that way, right? So I'm clear that I'm giving you this information, but I'm caveating it in the, here is the context of the data that I'm using to draw this conclusion, which is often not how we present data to the public. We present data to the public as if it is fact, right? Like the positivity rate in your city is this. Probably not. That's an estimate. It's either higher or lower based on some of the factors. But if we present people data as point of facts without putting that context in, they can't make their own conclusions from that data because they haven't been given the context to do so.
Interesting. Okay. No, I'm with you on that. So, you know, again, I'm still thinking about, you know, your fellow faculty members out there who are not data scientists by trade, if you will, but they want to introduce this to the classroom. So is it too late for them? How can they get some of these prerequisite skills and to help them use it as part of their classroom instruction?
So I think most PhDs have worked with data, right? Because we all had to get that big dissertation thing. And for most people, even in humanists, it involved some data. So I think most teachers have a bit of data literacy. The challenge is it's not something we're taught how to teach to other people. Like even if you yourself are data literate, it doesn't mean you know how to teach someone else to become data literate. And I'm gonna be honest, it's work. It's not like the first time I tried it, I got it right. Like it takes some iterations of like, oh, they got this concept, but maybe not this one. So we're like really evaluating your own work. And what I would say to my colleagues is like, infuse it bit by bit, right? Just a little piece of data, a little piece of ethics, a little piece of context. Like you don't have to change your whole course. But when you mention, so like when I mention a new data set, I give my students some background on that data set, even if it's a publicly available national data set, or if it's data that I've collected in my own research or data that I pulled off the internet, right? I'm really clear about one, where the data came from, how it was collected, what the purpose of it was for, and then how I intend to use it, because I might not be using it for the purpose that it was originally collected for. I'll give you a case in point. Most people have an electronic health record. Even if you've never accessed your own electronic health record, wherever you go to get healthcare probably has an electronic health record on you. Oftentimes, there's researchers analyzing that data. But electronic health record data was created for medical care, was not created to do the research. It doesn't mean it's not useful to answer a whole host of questions, but we just need to be clear about like, it wasn't collected to answer these questions. And we need to make sure that before we try to answer a question, that the data is appropriate to do that, right? And I think that is what I want my other colleagues to really get at. You don't have to be a data scientist to make a decision about, is this data appropriate to answer the question I have at hand? Right? And that is really the first step in data literacy, and often missed. You'll be surprised how many times people are using a data set and I go, like, this isn't the data to answer your question. And I'm a statistician. I'm not a magician. I can't make it do things that it wasn't, that it doesn't have. And I think, that's where my other colleagues can step in. It's just like a simple thing of like, is this data appropriate to answer the question? Why or why not? What are the potential biases? Am I going to use it anyway? Because sometimes we say it's not appropriate, but it's all I have, or it's the best I have. And so I'm going to use it anyway with these caveats. But I think if instructors really just started to answer that fundamental question, like, is this appropriate data to answer this question? That will turn on the literacy light for their students, because we're asking a real question about, do you understand the data well enough to make a decision about if it can answer the question you're interested in answering?
Right. No, very good. I mean, I'm thinking about, so I hear you. And so I think we've been talking about, I think, the technical skills that people have or need. And I really like that you brought up the ethics of it. But I guess the other side of it for me that I wanted to ask you about was, okay, we've got the technical skills. I'm with you on the ethics of it. But what soft skills do you think students need to have that are using data?
I think you have, so like most people who go into math or statistics or data science are either computer scientists or like statisticians. We often are not storytellers. But I think you have to be a good storyteller, or you have to be able to tell a story around the data. Data in themselves can be informative, but it's usually the story or the narrative that make data informative. And I always tell my students that it's important to remember, behind every data point is a person sometimes, or an institution or whatever, but like behind every data point, it's not just a point of data. It's either a human being who has a real life beyond what you see, or sometimes our data are at like an institution level. It's a real institution that like we see some data, but has other characteristics that we can't see. And so I think it's important for you to understand, like, there's a person behind the data, that what you often see is a snapshot in time about a specific topic, but it doesn't capture the whole of human life or the whole of like what a human is going to do. And data about humans are messy because humans are unpredictable sometimes, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Right? It's not going to always be perfect. And that's why the narrative is so important, right? Because you need to be able to explain, like, for the most part, we see this trend, but we're also seeing maybe some outliers or maybe a different trend in another subgroup. And right, that's usually the narrative part to tell the story. Or I'll give you another example. We've been doing some research using electronic health records, which originally I thought was great because it's like you get all this data, someone just pulls it, like, it's like not a lot of work to get this data. Someone pulls it from a computer and hands it over to you. But if you don't really understand electronic health records data, if you don't really understand the population, there's some things you could miss. We were doing this study, and as a statistician, I noticed that the data that we receive from the electronic health record doesn't really match the patient population of the hospital that it was pulled from. So then I needed to ask some questions like, does everyone have an electronic health record? Oh, who doesn't have an electronic, right? Like, so just really being able to act, these are important things that you need to think about that we often don't think about. Most people would have I got 300,000 observations. Most statisticians would have been out of their mind, happy with that amount of data, and would have just gone straight through to analysis, right? And I stopped and said, I'm not sure this data is generalizable to the population that it's coming from, right? And I'll give you an example of how I knew that. I live in New York City. It's one of the most diverse cities in the world. It has a high Latinx population. And the data that I got from the electronic health record said that the patient population was 1% Hispanic.
Oh, well, yeah. That was dirty data, right?
Dirty, I'm like, 1% Hispanic.
Right.
This just doesn't pass the sniff test, right? But there's many people who wouldn't have done that. They would have just gone and like analyzed their primary question without thinking about, the way I stopped at like demographics. I didn't even get to like the health question that we were trying to address. I said, there's no way that data from New York City has 1% Hispanic. So that either means that we are not documenting ethnicity in the log, which I found there's a lot of missing data, right? Or people are not reporting the data, right? But that's important to know before you get to making comparisons across racial groups for heart disease, let's say, or cancer or anything. It's important to know what the underlying population should have been. And that's a real data literacy thing, right? Like you have to understand what the data is that you're working with and what it should even look like, right? And if I didn't know enough about New York City, right, this is the context, right? And this is why I think we need diverse people working with data, because I'm from New York City. I knew enough to say, wait a minute, this seems off to me, right? And then the other data set we had was from Utah, which I don't know a lot about, but it made me ask them, like, does your Utah data look the way it should look? Because my New York City data is not looking the way I think it should look, if that makes sense.
Total sense. We're getting here close towards the end. I just one more question or sort of topic, if you will, I want to ask about as it relates to data teaching in the classroom. So we talked a lot about, almost exclusively about, how you teach it to students, how you work with them, how, you use it in a classroom. But how do you use it, or how can other faculty members use data and assessments they do on their students to inform how they actually teach classes?
So one of the things that we have at NYU is basically in our learning management system, which could be your Blackboard, your Canvas, or your Brightspace. Those are the main ones that people know of. We have this thing where you can integrate Tableau. They integrate Tableau into it. It basically does some analytics. So it lets me know, like, are my students even accessing my site? What are they accessing? And I can look at it by like, who did well on the exam? Did the student pull the homework the day before? Did they pull it the week before? Right? Like, so it gives you some data points. And then I can go to say to my students, like, this is not the kind of class where you want to start your homework the day before it's due, right? Like I can go back in and sort of reinforce some of the things that I want to give them based on what I'm seeing, right? Like I'm on lesson 3, but I notice most of you are clicking in lesson 1. Is there some topic that is in lesson 1 that we need to go back and revisit, right? And you can actually look at what they're clicking on to get a sense of like, let me review this topic because they keep going back to the slide deck for something, or they keep looking at different things. So yes, we can use these types of analytics in our own classes. The other thing I will say that I really like about Tableau and really changed the game for me as a statistician is, I don't know if I was taught this or I just felt this way, but I always thought like, I need to know what analysis I'm going to do going in. I need to have a plan, right? If I'm going to make a bar chart or a scatter, I need to know in advance. And Tableau really changed the way I think about that. So I think if you're doing hypothesis testing, you need to have some a priori stuff set in place. But if what you're doing is like data exploration to figure out like how my students are using my learning management system, Tableau is really nice because I don't have to know if I want a bar graph or a line. I can switch it, midway with the same data set and watch the visualizations. It also lets you use your data to get insights. So like you can point and click and dig deeper into the data, which is great for figuring out what is the story or what's the main point that I'm trying to tell from the data, or what do I want other people to know? And a lot of times for me, what I want people to know is not what's immediately visible, right? Like, because what's immediately visible in my bar chart, you can see. I'm usually want to know, like, you see this chart, but there's this one point in here that I want to talk about that you can't see in this chart that's really informative. Let's dig deeper into that.
Right.
And I think Tableau really changed my mind about data exploration, right? Not about how I'm hypothesis testing or doing my research, but when I have a problem and I don't know how I want to approach it, Tableau is really good because I am a visual person, right? So I'm a visual thinker. And it's nice that I can change my visualizations, right? Because when you change your visualizations, you might see things that you didn't see in a previous version of that sort of visualization.
Right.
And having the ability to do that quickly and easily, like with a point and click, really lets you dig deeper into a data set and pull out the insights, right? Like what is important to know. And often in education, we think we have an idea of what's important to know, But we can often be wrong about,
right.
Why are Black male students underperforming? Maybe they're underperforming, maybe they're not. Maybe they're underperforming in chemistry or some class, but not in every class, right? And so the ability to dig down and see like, who's underperforming, who's overperforming? Am I teaching in the middle so no one's benefiting, right? These things allow you to adjust on the fly. And I think my students really appreciate it because I'll come back and say, I looked at some data, I saw this thing and I want to review this topic because I don't think you're understanding it. Or I actually want to change the syllabus around because I think it's important for me to show you this before we get to the next step. And I think my students appreciate that, like, I'm thinking about their learning. They feel like I'm catering the class to their specific cohorts. I end up getting really good teaching evaluations because I think they feel like, oh, it's not the standard class. Like she's really every cohort I'm looking at, like what works for you. And I'm trying to adapt on the fly. I'm not making big changes. I can't make big changes to my syllabus mid-semester, but I can switch 2 lessons around. Like there are little tweaks that I can make. And if I think they're going to have a real impact, it's worth trying, right? And this sometimes I switch 2 lessons around and I thought, I'm actually going to change that in the syllabus because it does make sense for the students to see A before B, right? Just however you're thinking about it. So I think there's lots of ways for people to use data. And I think, at least for me, Tableau has changed the game in terms of one, visualization, but really trying to get information from my data set without a priori knowledge, right? Like without the like, I'm looking for this, right? Because sometimes I've come across something that I wasn't looking for, like, oh, the women in my class are not doing as well as the boys, right? Like, or the men. I would never make that assumption. My bias is that women are really smart because I'm a woman, right? And so I would never make that assumption. But sometimes the data shows you things that you may be biased to think the other way, right? And so I wasn't looking for that difference, but I was able to see it because I was digging through the data, right? And looking at something else.
Yeah. Okay. No, this is very good, enlightening. I mean, very enlightening. I think you definitely took us through data science, if you will, from A to Z, in the classroom, outside, in society, et cetera. So if there's an opportunity to audit your course, I would love to sign up. But in closing, I just got two more questions for you, and they're just fill in the blank. And if you could do that, and we'll wrap it up. So my first one to you is, without data, blank.
There's limited knowledge.
Okay, I like that. And this is for tonight. Mary J's best song is what?
Oh, you can't do that. That's hard, but I would have to say Real Love.
Okay, that's a good one.
Because I'm a Mary J. Blige fan from What's the 411, her first album, and I think that is a classic. And that's the music I was listening to when I was on the school bus going to school. So that's the music that is forever in my heart.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Goodman, for your time. We really appreciate it. Thanks to Tableau for bringing this program to us. And with that, I'd like to say that concludes this episode of In the Margin.